and welcome to Chapter 15, Learning Objective 7. In this particular learning objective, we're going to talk about demand side versus supply side economics and where those ideologies come from. So let me go ahead and share my screen with you. Okay, so we're looking at the emphasis is on the supply side fiscal policy because up to this point, we've really been looking at the aggregate demand and the demand side fiscal policy, but we're going to show the differences here in this particular objective. So what is supply side fiscal policy? Supply side fiscal policy are where we're looking at increasing aggregate supply. And remember, the aggregate supply is really those factors of production of land, labor, and capital. So if we're increasing, what we want to see is an increase in natural resources or in land, an increase in labor, or an increase in capital that is used. Now, each of these things, I also want to add technology to this. Now, these will shift the long run aggregate supply curve. Remember that the long run aggregate supply curve. And we have, let's see, aggregate demand. If we were right here, we're at a certain price level. Again, remember that's our inflation. And we're at real GDP. Now, at this particular long run aggregate supply curve, this is where we'll have the natural rate of unemployment. And this is where we start from, okay, the ideology. But there are some things which will shift the short run aggregate supply. So in the short run, aggregate supply will shift upward like this, aggregate supply, and then we'll have aggregate demand. In the longer term, this aggregate supply curve will be if we're fully utilizing all of our land, labor, and capital, and we will end up in this longer term state. But in the shorter term, we can also impact the aggregate supply curve. It can shift inward. It shifts inward when suppliers have expectations that the price level will increase in the future. So they will supply less today. So that would cause the inward shift of the aggregate supply curve. If the aggregate supply were to shift outward, this would be that they would expect that inflation might be lower in the future. Okay, so let's take a look at it. So fiscal policy, most economists believe that these short run effects really work through aggregate demand, okay? They're Keynesian economic theorists, but some of these fiscal policies might also affect aggregate supply. So again, the expectations in supplier are the short run aggregate supply. That's the expectations about what's going to happen with inflation. In the longer run aggregate supply, it's those things, as I mentioned in the previous slide, things like technology, factors of production of land, labor, and lastly, capital. And remember, capital are like machinery that you would use to produce a good or a service. So your book doesn't talk about the 10 principles, so I'm going to skip over that one, but here's an example. A cut in the tax rate, so taxes are decreasing, will give workers incentives to work more because they get to keep more of their earnings. So this is hitting at the long run aggregate supply variable of labor. So labor would increase. If labor increases, then short run aggregate supply would shift outward to the right, aggregate supply, and that will also, if it's longer term, the aggregate supply curve in the longer run would shift outward and to the right. Okay, supply side economics, right? So government purchases might be some examples of aggregate supply. So let's say the government increases spending on infrastructure or roads. We've seen this as of in the Trump administration. That was one thing that we saw. That might increase productivity. And again, the productivity kind of being the combination of land, labor, and capital hence increasing the quantity of goods and services. So long run aggregate supply shifting outward to the right, long run aggregate supply. How does that impact us? If this is aggregate demand, then the price level was originally here. And now we see with after that shift is the price level would decrease, which if you're thinking ahead on this, you might go, well, that also will affect short run aggregate supply. You're absolutely right. Again, more relevant in the long run because it takes more time to build roads, more time for infrastructure. So we tend to think of it as a shift in the long run aggregate supply curve. So what's the difference between demand side versus supply side economics? So if we look at demand side, the idea is increasing government spending and decreasing taxes. What will happen in that respect is it will shift the aggregate demand curve outward and to the right. Okay. So here's an example. Here's demand side fiscal policy. Again, a decrease in taxes and an increase in spending. Right now, where our current state is that we have a consumer price index of 150 basis points and the real GDP is at 8. Then we increase government spending, decrease taxes, and that shifts the aggregate demand curve outward to the right. Notice the effect of that is an increase in the price level. Prices will go up, but real GDP will go up as a result. And again, more than compensating for that increase in inflation, as we discussed in the previous objective. These are Keynesian based upon John Maynard Keynes. Okay, now let's look at the supply side, economic side about what causes what. So there might be a decrease in resource prices, again, land, labor, capital, technological advances, decrease in taxes or subsidies, and a decrease in regulations. All of these things, and if you're kind of thinking during the Trump administration, yes, you tended to see a lot of these. Then you're going to see an increase in the aggregate demand curve. So here is supply side fiscal policy. Notice we're going to start right here at a price level of 150, real GDP at 8 trillion. Now we're going to enact some of these things, a decrease in resource prices. Labor, when the right to work laws are starting to be passed, that would be a decrease in labor because we know that unions will increase wage rates. Technological advances. You might see this happen through the government spending of increasing grants, increasing research and development. Decreasing taxes. We saw that definitely in the Trump administration. Decrease in taxes, a decrease in subsidies. So those are the transfer payments. So government spending decreasing, or a decrease in regulations, which we also saw during the Trump administration. Those things will cause then the aggregate supply curve to shift outward and to the right. What is the effect of this? The net effect is, notice now we're going to be at a lower price level here at 100. So the price level is going to decrease and real GDP will increase as a result. And here we end up at a new full employment. So before the labor, let's see. Okay, so here we have wage rate. So again, remember those factors of production, land, labor, capital. So here, the wage rate, we're going to start up here at wage rate 1. We'll say $10, okay? Not a very high one, but we just need some numbers. And let's say we have 1 trillion workers. Now we have a tax cut labor supply. What might a tax cut labor supply be? It might be a tax cut to corporations. It also might be that we have a tax cut so that you get to keep more of your earnings. What essentially will this happen? This will make the after-tax labor supply shift outward. Notice that's going to drive the wage rate lower, say $7, okay? And we're going to end up at a quantity of labor higher. Again, this was a tax side. So supply side, and again, why do we know it's supply side? Because it's really affecting that aggregate supply curve. That's where we get the term supply side economics. I like this particular graph because here's supply side policy and here is demand side. And you might be thinking political. Yes, it is kind of, this is more Republican and this is more Democratic. Okay, so you can kind of see how it trickles into the economy. Notice that the end result is the same, except here employment rises and inflation is reduced. So inflation reduced. Here, inflation is an increase. So is one better than the other? And the answer is no. It all depends on the situation that we're in. Okay, hopefully that helps to explain the difference between demand and supply side economics. And I'll see you back in our last objective, which is where I'm going to actually turn it over to something I use in my microeconomics course and talk about the Laffer curve. And that is, what's the right amount to tax? And your book does go into some of the drawbacks from the Laffer curve and the criticisms of such. And I would highlight those and make sure that you read those in your chapter. Thank you and have a great day.